Welcome to the Early Childhood Development in a Time of Pandemic webinar series. Today's topic is peer relations. The series will be facilitated by Isabelle Vinet, an expert in prevention of disruptive behaviors during early childhood, and she's the Executive Director of CEECD. For today's webinar, we are also delighted to welcome Michel Boivin as a co-presenter. He holds the Canada Research Chair on Child Social Development and is Professor of Psychology at the School of Psychology at Université Laval. He leads a research program on the biological, psychological, and social components of early childhood development.
So today we'll be exploring a little bit more broader, the peer relations as a whole. I don't want to go too quickly on that picture. I think it's a nice picture of children feeling good with each other. And it's a challenge, and we know these days that children may miss their friends a lot. So let's take that into account. So peer relation, why it matters. Although it cannot explain everything, we know that, positive peer relations are something that we are looking for every child, as it supports, the harmonious global development of children. Of course, within those relationships that we have, we learn so much. We learn how to become a friend. We learn how to develop our self-control skills, because, wait for your turn is something that you need to understand quickly within a peer group. So, of course, peer relations are, they promote those skills. So they are linked with the development of social skills, and we know that they promote school perseverance and academic success, along or together with, of course, individual characteristics. And I know that so much is still to learn about those characteristics. It doesn't, peer relations that doesn't explain it all, but still we know that it's something that when we work on it can really help children in their development. The earlier it seems that we support positive peer relationship, well, the more likely we think there's something about social acceptance that will be taking in place slowly during the preschool years and primary school years also. And this is, social acceptance is so important because, at the opposite end of a spectrum, there's peer rejection that I'm going to be addressing today. Peer rejection is something that we know we can work on when we see it in terms of preventing problems to add on. But we know that, within a group of peer and within those specific relationship and friendships, we can promote social acceptance. So social skills, of course, if you were there last week, you know that we've been talking a little bit more about, prosocial behavior. And we discussed that prosocial behaviors are one kind of social skills. That social skills, it's a whole series of different behaviors that we want to address. And those related to the social emotional development of children may be divided in those four categories. So the three pale blue ones that we addressed, along our seminars, through our seminars, we know that that emotional competence is part of those skills that we want to support very early on. So we've discussed the importance of understanding emotion for children and helping them to recognize those signs of the emotions in themselves with the facial features and the physical signs of it, but also in others. We know that it's linked to empathy, understanding the emotions of others, expressing it, having the right to, and also regulating, those behaviors and learning how to calm down when we're angry or sad. And so the cooperative skills are around prosocial behaviors that we've discussed. So sharing, offering help is one category, is very important categories. And we discuss it as, those behaviors that make children cute and still, wanting us to help them, even though they have some challenges with some behaviors. It's a protective factor. And we know that, those skills, when you learn to inhibit the behaviors and inhibit aggressive behaviors, is something that needs to be developed in children, so they are accepted with their peers, because we want those aggressive behaviors to go down. But the first box, we discussed it a little bit less. We can include within all those skills the communication skills. And those communication skills, are about being a good listener. And the question is, what is a good listener really? Well, a good listener is for sure someone who, when you to talk to that person, he looks at you in the eye and he asks questions about what you're saying. And, it's those skills. I often say, in my neighborhood or in Montreal, sometimes we don't see that much adults using those specific skills of making us feel so good when we share something. So we choose those adults, right? When we have something to share that is very nice and exciting, but also when we're sad and we want to address things, we're going to choose those people who have those communication skills. So what we know in young children, when we evaluate social competence as a whole, we see that not many children have those communication skills, but those who do, they really are good in every other skills, and they are very appreciated and very popular. So it's a good thing to consider those skills also. And it's about saying to a child, well, you know what, when you ask me how I feel, how I'm feeling, I really feel good. Thank you for asking, right? And when you said to your friend, oh, your cat is sick, tell me about it. You're showing interest. And so we know that we can teach those skills to children and they will learn it, even if it's not that natural for them, because some children, we know it's more natural and they're not very big in numbers, but we can still work on those skills with young children. So what do we know? We have asked you a question about, at what age you think that friendships are have the most impact. And I don't know, Pamela, if we have some results of the poll yet, or maybe it's a little bit too early.
Yeah, we do have some results already. We had more than 300 who participated in this poll, and 49% responded that it's between 3.5 years and 5 years. And 23% responded that it's between 1 and 3 years of age, at the same time as between 6 and 12 years old. So both have the similar percentage of 23%, and 5% responded that it's in adolescence.
Interesting. I will be interested in knowing Michel's point of view on those results. So I will be giving him asking him to join in 2 minutes. I think it's some kind of a tricky questions, and it's not that clear, at what age. But in order to have an understanding of the importance of friendship and building relationship and positive relationships, we need to consider a developmental, aspect of it. So, very early on, we don't talk about friendships, or we don't talk about relationships with among peers when children are 1 or 1.5. We talk a little bit more about, interactions. So they interact, they interact with their neighbors, they interact with their siblings, they interact in the learning centers, of course. But then slowly we can say, there are first signs, those very, very early signs of friendship develop. We know there's some things happening when children before the end of the preschool period, and then a little bit earlier. But then there are reasons why, those children become friends over time, and it's sometimes about interest that they share. We know gender plays a role. We know interest plays also a role in how those relationships are built. And of course, there's something happening in a little bit later during the end of primary school and maybe high school, that is different about friendship. So I would be willing to hear, Michel, what I know you've been studying for so many years with those longitudinal studies that sometimes, they started more than 30 years ago. I know you have some answers of how we can analyze those relationships. I don't know if you have something you would like to share with us.
Thank you, Isabelle, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I was looking at the answers, and I'm quite surprised by the fact that overwhelmingly people say that the greatest impact on children's development of friendship is around the early years. So the most important period mentioned is maybe between 3 and 5 years. I was a bit surprised by the fact that very few have indicated adolescence as a critical period for those features of the social world. I think that the best answer, all of these answers are good, because as you've mentioned, social development is dynamic, and the role of peer relations will evolve with age, and their functions will also change with age. I would like perhaps start by making a few nuances about the way we address these questions as scientists. So we like to be specific about the way we address this question, and for that we try to define different level of analysis. The first level of analysis is the behavior of a child, or the way he interacts with people. So what children do. So that's one way to address the question of relationships and how they are built. The second level of analysis is the relationship, and I will speak more to that later, but it's essentially with whom children affiliate. And this is a very important question, having to do with selection of friends, for instance. And the larger picture is the one that we address perhaps later during development, is that of the peer group or the network. So we can define peer relations and the way a child is involved in peer relations at these different levels by looking at his behavior, the way he interacts, by looking at his relationship, and looking at the network as a whole, or the peer group as a whole, and the response of the peer group at some point in groups of children. So these, not only do these level of analysis change with age, so they get established progressively as children age, but also they do not develop at the same time, but also their functions will change with age. They tend to grow in complexity from, for instance, eye-gazing contact from a child who is very, very young, around a few months of age, to very complex playing games that the children will perform by the end of preschool, to very complex association pattern in the networks when they get into grade school. So they gain in complexity, and they also have specific features. I would like perhaps to address friendship as a specific peer relation. The specific feature of a friendship is different than the other features that I've mentioned. Essentially, friendship among peers is defined as a relation among equals. It's important to take note of that, because this is how peer relation differs from, say, parent-child relation. It's a different type of relationship that is, in principle, based on equals. So that makes it very unique in terms of the potential to contribute to development. Friendship is also defined by another important feature. It is mutual. So we define a friendship by the fact that I'm selecting you as a friend and you select me as a friend. It's not only a unidirectional aspect, it has a bidirectional aspect to it. And the third aspect that also show a sign of development is the fact that it's stable. In principle, of friendship must show some kind of stability, but again, it will change with age. This stability will be more likely to be shown when children are older than when they are younger. So what do they serve as a function? And again, friendship defined differently across ages will provide different provisions for development. First, they provide a context. So they provide a context for communicative skills, cooperation. That's a way you first experience cooperation or learn ways to cooperate. They also provide a context where negotiation happens. So it's an important aspect of development to learn to negotiate things, to get an agreement on specific features. So this is maybe one specific function of peer relations, to provide a context for negotiation. Of course, relations among peers are also a context where you'll have disagreement, and sometimes you'll have competition, and you need to negotiate these aspects as well. So it's a very complex interactions that are happening within friends that provide for the learning of skills to negotiate communication, to negotiate competition and disagreement. In the early years, it is agreed that peer relations and friendship provide mainly for companionship. So it's a way to get people to play with you. So it's a context where companionship allows for to play more complex games and activities. And peers in that context can be seen as socializing agents. They are models for children. There's a lot of imitation. If one look at children aged around 2, there's a lot of imitation going on. So that's provided by the context, often provided by the context of emerging friendship. I don't think we can speak of friendship at age 2 if we refer to the definition I gave, but essentially it's a context where there's a lot of imitation. They provide feedback. Peers will provide feedback on what is your behavior. So they can provide feedback, and they also provide sanctions. So the peer context provide a way to get feedback on your behavior, and that's really where you start constructing yourself. So when do these friendship defined as a mutual relation that is stable emerge? It's about age 4 or age 5. There's a lot of peer interactions before that, but friendships really emerge around age 4 and 5. It is initially based on proximity, physical proximity, and shared activities, as I mentioned, mainly centered around play, but progressively it will move to some form of selection. So friends will not only be those that are in proximity to you, but also you will start selecting friends on the basis of your play preference, on the way they behave. Sometimes you will try to withdraw from interacting with some peers because their behavior is not to your pleasure. So this is happening around age 4, or starting around age 4 and 5. But as they get older, children will establish friendship that are more based on their selection of friends, and this will also provide some form of validation of the self. So a friend will be someone who will have you will have interactions with, they will provide feedback to you, and that will help you define who you are in terms of your competence. Who am I as a person? So that's you see that the provisions go from companionship and play partners to someone with whom you will have exchanges, and you will be able to define yourself more precisely over time. And finally, friends also, when you get to later pre-adolescence, adolescence, would also feel the need for acceptance. So it becomes very important during mid childhood to adolescence to be accepted by a group, providing a sense of validity. And so that's another function that, again, is developing over time. So the answer to the question, at what age do children matter more, I think it's a developmental answer that we need to provide. It's important from very early on to certainly at least up to adolescence.
Thank you, Michel. And you're talking about the acceptance, right? Social acceptance that has an impact. So if we pursue on this and go, at the other end of peer acceptance is peer rejection. Very interesting, Michel, and bringing the fact that we don't talk about the same things along the way, as a developmental perspective. Children, they learn from interactions, and then they learn from those specific friendships that are building more and they know, the social skills, how to behave, but they receive also in that intimacy that they build that comes with relationship. They understand what is a good behavior and what is not acceptable. And if I want to pursue a relationship, I need to adjust, right? So it's so rich, and my slide is not moving. Just I got my sorry. Okay, so those relationships, they can also prevent peer rejection. And Michel, so those relationships that with difficulties and peer rejection, there is evidence, right, that peer rejection can amplify difficulties already observable in some children. But then again, all those characteristics of that child, prior to the rejection, or is there something happening with peer rejection that creates some symptoms or distress in young children? Because one thing, and this is where I want you to feel free to pitch in. What we see, and surely we need to be careful about causal effect, but peer rejection, when it sets in, it can contribute to the emergence of distress for some children. It may contribute to loss of motivation for the learning activities, play being one of them, and of course the most powerful activity in the young children. And there's a tendency to gather, right, to be involved with the children with the same difficulties. So we can see that. I know your studies have shown some association between peer rejection and a loss of motivation, the fact that children tend to become partners and play with the same difficulties they seem to gather. And this is something I think good for them, because they feel that the group is accepting them, but it may be it may be something that maybe worsens some difficulties. And if we are part of a group that we feel we're strong together, but it's not the main group or the main network, the principal network, it may become a problem, right, in terms of children gathering together and not wanting to comply to some rules, the social rules.
Well, I think you're addressing two different types of difficulties, one of which is what you call peer rejection. And then you can define it in different ways. We speak of peer victimization. So I would make a difference between peer rejection and these are two obviously related constructs, but peer rejection is really the feeling that the group entertains toward you. So you can be popular, or you can be kind of rejected by the majority of the group, and so it's more a feeling that people entertain toward you. Whereas peer victimization is really the actual behavior. These two are related, but we see those conditions or situations happening very early in development, quite earlier than I would have expected. So we have.
At what age, you said? Yeah.
Sorry?
At what age do you see some peer rejection happening?
We start, if you ask mothers to mention or evaluate whether their children are having peer difficulties in general, based on their judgment, we can say that starting at age 4, maybe even earlier than that, you will have kids who, by and large, are somewhat rejected or even victimized by the peer group. Now, I use the term victimization, but it's more because it's connotated. Victimization is a vulnerable child being picked upon, whereas it's more a child who's having difficulties, where the difficulties are the group reacting negatively toward him or her. It doesn't mean that it's victimization per se, but it's happening very early, around age 4, I would say. And of course, it's well documented in grade school. Some kids are rejected, some kids are victimized, and there's a variety of reasons for that. Some of these reasons have to do with the child characteristics, the way he or she behaves, and of course there are other types of conditions, like it's more likely in some schools children are more likely to be rejected and victimized because those kinds of behaviors are maybe more tolerated than others. So there's a climate factor in that. But by and large, when you look at the determinants, it's the child characteristics that are more associated, more likely to predict to his or her being rejected and victimized. And that starts very early. And the main determinant is, I mean, it's been amply documented that being aggressive, being overreactive and aggressive tend to bring rejection and tend to bring victimization. And it starts very early. But of course, it's very simple to say it's only the child's fault. It's not the child's fault. It's the child being vulnerable because he has self-control problem, and that makes it more likely, and more likely not necessarily him being the victim of others' aggression. So it's a reaction of the peer group to his or her way of acting. Now, if you move a bit further down the line in terms of development, you'll have another group of kids who will, but that's not happening in preschool. That's happening in late grade school, like in late childhood, early adolescence. There will be a small group of kids who will tend to show withdrawal patterns. They tend to be shy and withdrawn, to prefer to be alone. And this group of kids, some of them will also become more rejected and more victimized. But that's happening maybe in late primary school.
So, Michel, would you say that in order to act early on this and prevent peer rejection or act on it, we have to work to support children individually, right? On
Absolutely,
the child level,
because the behavior that I've mentioned, we've documented that aggression early, so as early as 18 months. So child who is being aggressive at age 2 will tend to be rejected and victimized later on. So it starts very early. There's a combination of factors. Actually, there are 2. So it's not a simple equation, only the child's characteristics, but also family characteristics, including low income and having been exposed to harsh reactive parenting that predicts over and above the child being aggressive, that predicts to these difficulties later on. So it starts very early, and it speaks to the importance of starting intervention very early to prevent these things from happening.
And starting by supporting parents and families. So thank you, Michel. Thank you so much. And so I hope it's aligned with with your thought, Michel, but what can be done? So in terms of concretely, in our households, but of course within our centers, is to teach really social skills, and then to use the whole group, to work as a strength to support maybe one specific child. Sometimes we implement some social skills training program, and we know that the school or the center has one child or two in mind, but the way we work, right, we want to make sure that we support that child, but we work within the group, right, and teaching all the skills. And so there's something about being the sentiments of the sense of group that is very important. So it comes, and maybe 30 years ago, when we were trying to develop those skills, we used to take out children from their classroom and all those children with difficulties and work in a small room aside with all those with difficulties. We don't do that anymore, right? We work, and we know that it's important to have positive peer helping and supporting this. So those ingredients within those programs are about teaching, modeling those behaviors, make practice happening during the day-to-day basis in our routine, so guided practice and reinforcement. So briefly, about how they work, those programs, and we see the whole group is there, and the teacher is probably addressing some issue there. But it's a good thing to take a quiet time and make time to have those discussions, use stories, use puppet to illustrate really what our expectation of that behavior, what it means to be sharing, and why do we want this in our group. And so the modeling part is something that, comes when like a discussion happening, and that discussion is about addressing issues that children find important, that are related to their reality. So we can use, of course, stories where there are emotions, and we've discussed it earlier, but, to really model, to make a clear picture of what is expected. So this is to be considered. We need a time to illustrate this, to put it on the wall, to have poster, to be very clear about our expectation. The first ingredient in those programs is modeling, and it's for the whole group. Then it's to be using, of course, practice, but to be, it's a graduated support, we call. So, in that picture, we see that, the adult is very involved because that child learning to walk is, needs a lot of support. And it's the same thing with social skills. We should be providing, do for the child at the very first, and do with, and then let do, right? So being progressive about it. But what we observe sometimes is we go a little bit too quickly, saying, well, he knows, what to do. He knows my expectation. And when a child comes to his educator or teacher and says, what, I need help, he doesn't want to share. Well, sometimes, or we may tend to say, well, you know what to do, go ask for it, but it's not clear that they know exactly what to do. So it pays off to provide more support than less, and of course to let go that support. You want them to become autonomous about those behaviors, but sometimes we take for granted that it's so natural, to ask for something or to share or to wait for his turn. But when they come for us for support, it's a good thing to maybe invest a little bit more time at the very beginning to support the practice of those skills. Reinforcement, positive reinforcement. There's a program, one of the best practice in the world, called the program Fast Track. It's not important, the name of the program, but still, it's been well documented, and it's been done over and over again, and always have the same effect. So it means that something is interesting. And in those studies about that program Fast Track, one ingredient came out as something very, very important, and it's about the way children are being reinforced within the group. So yes, incentives are part of the positive reinforcement strategies, but basically the sense of worth, that relationship above all, that strength of, that model that is the parent, of course, and the educator, and is so important to give a sense that your behavior is so important. So provide attention, but not only on behaviors, and sometimes we may say, well, that child, we may observe him and try to give him positive reinforcement, but that good behavior will not come out. I cannot reinforce that. Well, we can reinforce a smile, an interest, a talent that the child has. And we gain from being very specific. I'm proud of you because you did this. And sometimes, in one point in my career, a 6-year-old came to me and said, could you use another word that I'm proud of you? You always say that, right? And I thought I was so clear about, being specific and wanting to reinforce that behavior. But he was saying, it doesn't make any sense. You say that, for anything or nothing. So being specific and very clear, so children, they know that we really saw something that we are proud of, and we are saying it's not something in the air, it's something specific, and not just the strategy, the way we reinforce some children. More timid children or anxious children, they don't like the big spotlight on what they did. So the use of indirect reinforcement seems to be a good thing to do. And of course, material and incentives are sometimes the first step for some children to get in the game. One thing and I know Michel and colleagues, they have worked on those the importance of peers and the positive perception of peers. And one thing that came out from one of the experiment that you were part of, Michel, is there's something good about bringing under the spotlight those talents, those hidden talents. So that's why I've chosen that picture where maybe that child is more shy, and maybe those positive behaviors are maybe less observable. But if you've heard that child, she knows about Ghana, or she knows about a country in the world, and you bring that globe, and you give her a space in the group where she can her talent may be known. Well, we work on the positive perception of peers, and that's why and Michel, you were saying the group is so important. So sometimes it's not as much the behavior we can address and say, well, we're proud. Sometimes we need to go a little bit further and bring those things interesting. Remember, our goal here is to make sure that every child is being seen as an interesting partner.
I think the group is important because, if I may interject, because it's at some point the child who is being rejected and being victimized, given his some behaviors, aggressive behaviors, or hyperactive, or lack of self-control, it will develop a negative reputation that works against him being somewhat rehabilitated within the group. So having the peers involved is a really, really important part of the intervention to break this negative cycle.
And so peer pairing, right? And you addressed that with me a few days ago, the importance of having one friend. We're not looking at numbers and many, many friends for every child to at least develop something. And we're talking about friendship and all that's learned within that special relationship. So it is a good thing. And it has been documented that when you peer one prosocial child, well, a child having more prosocial behaviors and maybe an at-risk child together, there's something about they learn in that proximity, and they, that both of them, they learn what to do and what not to do to stay in that relationship. But if we choose to do that, it's a good thing to supervise that there's an adult there, because you don't want to recreate a situation where the child will be feeling bad or feeling again rejection. So it needs to be very positive, and it needs to be one adult, two children, and working on something there. But of course, it's been documented later on, more maybe with the school-age children, but it's a good thing to try. And you were talking about proximity, and we know that the first indicators of friendship and why two children at a very young age become friends, the first variable seems to be they are close together, playing in the same area. So we can sometimes trick things and maybe add another child there. So if we want to match more different kids together in terms of the good influence coming. So I guess this is it for Michel and myself. Back to you, Zindu.
Well, thank you so much, Isabelle and Michel. It's such an interesting topic and so much great discussion. We have a few minutes left for our discussion. There are some interesting comments and questions in the chat box as well. I'm going to ask Kelly Stone, our CEO from Families Canada, to open the discussion with a question or comment. Kelly?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Zindu. And again, thanks everyone for coming today. These are such interesting discussions, and I really appreciate Isabelle and Michel being our hosts today. Michel, you talked about relationships and how they build over time and how important they are in terms of support for healthy development. What about where there is ongoing conflict with siblings? How does that affect child development?
Yes, sibling is a quite unique type of relationship. I would not equate it to peers, not necessarily so, because they can take different forms. What's typical of a sibling is that there may be an age difference. So that changes a lot the relation if there's a large or narrow age difference. Perhaps if the age difference is narrow, then we can think in terms of peers, but a very special peer in the sense that it's not a peer that you selected, right? It's someone, it's a given, it's part of the family. So you don't select that person, it's your brother and sister. So that makes it very unique. It's also a long-term relation, right? And so that's quite a unique feature. You're stuck with your brothers, and for better and worse, with your brother and your sister. So you cannot just walk away because the relation is getting sour, for instance. So that makes it very unique, and also what makes it very unique, especially in those times of confinement, is the fact that siblings are part of the family system. So what happens among siblings will also likely affect the family as a whole. So the importance of having a good sibling relation or maintaining good sibling relation is paramount, especially in these times where we are confined. So I'm not an expert on sibling relationship. I just my field is more peer relations, but I can sense that sibling relations have special features that makes it very important, especially in those times. So I would perhaps turn to the audience and how do you, as people are as parents, for instance, how do you think about those terms? What kinds, especially in those kinds where we are confined, how do you deal with that? How do you make sure sibling relations that are not optimal will not turn sour? How do you maintain, especially in those times when we are together for a long time in a stressful situation? How do you deal with this? How do you get by? So I'd be very happy to learn more about what the people in the audience have to say about that.
Thanks, Michel. Thanks, Isabelle. We do have a lot of comments and questions that are coming up in the chat box along similar lines to what you are saying as well. And one of the topics that are coming up is, during this time of pandemic, having relationships is a little bit different. And one person saying, for example, that her son is not keen on having online relationships. And others saying that, what do we do when we go back from this confinement period into the classrooms? And what can parents and educators and teachers do to support them? So maybe we have time for some comments on that while the audience thinks about your question just now as well, and maybe post some comments in the comment box. What would you say, Michel and Isabelle, to how would people support children going back to school after this period of confinement?
I guess, well, the question is also how the schools will be ready to, welcome children. are they prepared, to say that maybe for some children, more distress will be there, more anxiety, more aggressive behaviors to be dealt with, and are we willing to understand and say, well, there's a need there, right, behind it. So there's something I guess there, we were talking about the group, and I think for parents, well, it's my opinion, but I think that for parents, already to say, well, we have so much on our shoulders, and our role is to be there and warm, in a warm relationship as much as we can, secure our child, and not always, like we were addressing, with anxiety, over prepare them to go back to school, and I hope you won't be behaving this way when you go back to your, because it just, not amplify on those behaviors we see, try to, the routine that we talked about, self-regulation is behind those behaviors, and what is about supporting it, right? So, and I guess, again, to be indulgent with ourselves.
If I may add, I would say there's no general rule in that. It depends on the family, depends on the child, because some child are more anxious than others, and of course, some parents are more anxious than others. So if you are anxious about the situation, it's dangerous, or it's maybe not optimal to carry this to your child. So your child may be affected by your way. The way you talk about the situation. I know for me, for instance, I do a lot of news watching. At some point, I get overwhelmed by, well, the bad news. So the media may have a negative impact on you, and you may carry this on to your child as well. So I think I don't have any answers to that. I'm simply stating depends. I think you have to consider the unit as a whole, and you're part of it, and you're responsible to is creating the context for your child not being too anxious while going to school. At the same time, making sure the school, as Isabelle mentioned, is ready to welcome your child.
Very, very interesting points. Afraid we'll have to wrap up now. We are going to be pushing into our French webinar that will be starting out in just a few minutes. But thank you so much, Isabelle and Michel, for your presentation today. Such an important topic and so much to talk about. We hope we can be continuing this discussion in some way or form in the future, of course. Have a great time, everybody. Take care. Bye.